Hello, today we got an amazing partial insight into two things we often don't see very clearly. Number one, the personal relationships in the royal family, like who gets invited to Christmas and not. And secondly, what the British government thinks the Chinese government might be trying to do to influence events here in the UK. That's what we will discuss on this episode of Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and in the second half of this episode, we're going to look at the massive changes that have been proposed by the government today about how England is governed, getting rid of a whole tier of local government and creating a load of new mayors and giving them a load of extra powers. So there are more Sadiq Khans and more Andy Burnhams and more Tracy Brabins. And it's all in the name of, you guessed it, economic growth. And we will find out from somebody who has studied the plans in detail what's going to happen and what the prospects for economic growth are. But first of all, you've probably seen rumbling over the last few days these claims of an alleged Chinese spy at the heart of the British establishment. So at the heart of the British establishment that this person had quite a lot of FaceTime with Prince Andrew. And as a result, Prince Andrew is now not going to attend the royal family's Christmas Day celebrations in Sandringham. And the other thing that we learned on Monday is the name of this person at the heart of all these allegations. He's a Chinese businessman called Yang Tengbo. And his anonymity was lifted by the special secretive court that has been chewing over all of this over the last few days and is the reason we actually know that this person exists and that these claims have been made against him, claims which he vehemently denies. Okay, this is a very knotty, thorny news story to untangle, so let's do that now with friend of the podcast, BBC Home and Legal Affairs correspondent, Dominic Casciani. Hello, Dom.
Hi, Adam. Hi.
A busy and quite complicated couple of days for you.
Yeah, escalated very quickly.
And we're also joined by Charles Parton, who's a former diplomat who's worked in China. He's also an associate fellow at the think tank RUSI, and he works for the Council on Geostrategy. Hello, Charles.
Good evening.
What is the Council on Geostrategy?
It's a new think tank. It's about 3 years old, young, nimble, and as it says on the tin, it does geostrategy and geopolitics. And I would like to think it's one of the main repositories of expertise on China in this country. We don't have a great deal of think tanks that deal with China, sadly, unlike America, but there's a good, considerable body of knowledge accumulated there.
And there's a lot of thinking to do and kind of clues to piece together to get the bigger picture, which we'll ask you about in a second. Dom, first of all, before we talk about kind of the details that have emerged, how has any of this emerged in the first place?
With a court judgment, which became public late on Thursday, and in one of those slightly odd ways that sometimes happens, almost everybody missed it, myself included. I fess up to this. This was a judgment from the Special Immigration Appeals Commission, and that is a semi-secret court that deals with an awful lot of national security-related cases where the Home Secretary has used his or her exceptional powers to exclude somebody from the UK or to strip them of their nationality or cancel their passport on grounds that they are either a terrorist, involved in espionage, or some kind of very, very high-level organised criminal. So the reason why it's semi-secret is that it is dealing with intelligence reports from security agencies, i.e. MI5, basically MI5. So in this case, we have the situation where the Home Secretary has used her powers, it was Suella Braverman at the time, to ban this suspected Chinese spy from the UK. And when he appealed, that then required the Home Secretary to put forward her evidence, which involved MI5's secret intelligence assessments, whatever they are, we don't know, behind closed doors, and that all gets challenged.
And is that when the Prince Andrew alleged connection came out?
That's exactly it. And it's in the judgment from SIAC that we have these staggering lines which came out, which we were all reporting on Friday, that this man, who at the time was only known by the cipher H6, had won an unusual degree of trust with the prince. He was considered a close confidant. He'd attended his birthday in 2020. There weren't many people there at that birthday. And in essence, there was an assessment that he was running effectively a form of espionage, which is basically political interference, where you're trying to gain influence it's kind of called elite capture as well. So you basically target a member of an elite in a country in order to exert influence over them.
And then just in kind of like the processy timeline,
Yeah.
this person was known as H6 until basically lunchtime on Monday. What changed then? How do we find out he's actually a guy called Yang Tengbo?
Yeah. So Mr. Yang became Mr. Yang publicly because his lawyer went into court at 2:00 this afternoon and in a little over 10 minutes threw in the towel on behalf of his client and said he accepts in the public interest he now has to be named. Now, I've got to be honest, there's a certain degree of inevitability about this, Adam, on a number of levels. So the first was that it wouldn't take long to Google and find his name because he was being named in some of the foreign media. There was stuff floating around in China as well, I understand from a colleague. There were suggestions that at least 2 MPs were were flirting with the idea of using parliamentary privilege.
Which is where you could basically name somebody in these legal proceedings if it's in Parliament and you can just say it out loud in a way that you wouldn't be able to say it out loud perhaps on a podcast.
Yeah. And that would pose really interesting questions for us because we'd broadcast that live, but then we wouldn't necessarily be able to repeat it. But thirdly, and I think this is the most important element of this, I got into the weeds of the documents this afternoon and it became clear that in November, the court that's been overseeing his appeal against his banning order, they concluded that it was actually in the public interest to name him. He hadn't put forward sufficient evidence to retain his anonymity. He has showed us.
Oh, he hadn't made the case for staying anonymous.
Yeah. He hadn't made the case for overturning the banning order and he hadn't made the case for remaining anonymous, where he's got to show some kind of harm. And unusually, this court decided, well, we're going to name you. And the reason why that's unusual is because this court is so secret and it's dealing with effectively findings and consequences for people's lives, which are so important because someone gets excluded from an entire country. That typically speaking, it accepts that people should remain anonymous. I can count on one hand the number of people who I can think of who have been public in the Pike proceedings, and one of them is Shamima Begum because she waived her right to anonymity. So it's unusual.
And Yang Tengbo wasn't just somebody who wanted to kind of like pop over to the UK for a bit and wasn't allowed to. He'd spent many years living here, studying here, working here, running business here, investing here.
Yep. So he first came here in 2002, and he came here as having had a career of some sorts as a junior civil servant in China. He eventually joined the University of York and did a master's in public administration. He then decided to stay. Now, curiously, a lot of this detail is in the BBC profile of him from 2006 on the BBC's China service. So if you're
because they did a big piece about Chinese students.
They were doing like a series on Chinese students, and he happened to be one of the ones who got profiled. That raises questions in my head about how he gets profiled, but that's just me speculating. But in that profile, he talks about wanting to stay in the UK. He eventually founded a company which initially was involved in sort of travel services, but ultimately that actually became a bit of a behemoth, which was linking up British companies with Chinese investors and basically acting as a consultant. If you wanted to basically get a business into China, Mr. Yang was there saying, I can help you. And his network of influence grew and grew and grew. So, I mean, how influential was he? Well, we obviously know about the Prince Andrew element, where one of Prince Andrew's advisors described him in a private letter, as being at the top of a tree that many people want to be on. He met David Cameron and Theresa May when they were prime ministers. He attended annual meetings of the national legislature in China in 2019 and 2020. He was an honorary member of a major UK-China business group called the 48 Group Club. And although that group has said he was simply an honorary member, he had no real involvement as such. But it doesn't take long. You can basically Google him and you'll see him in places with people of influence. And
he's put out a quite long statement, very vehemently denying any kind of intelligence gathering or anything you could describe as spying, and saying that actually this is his adopted country and he loves it very much and would never do anything to harm its interests.
Yeah, he describes the UK as his second home. He was given the form of immigration status, which meant he could basically live here indefinitely, so he was splitting his time between the two countries. before the pandemic, made things more complicated. He described himself. He said, "I am an independent, self-made entrepreneur, and I've always aimed to foster partnerships and build bridges between the East and the West. I've dedicated my professional life in the UK to building links between British and Chinese businesses. I've done nothing wrong. The description of me as a spy is entirely untrue." And I think this is really interesting. He says that the political climate has changed, and unfortunately, I have fallen victim to this. When relations are good and Chinese investment is sought, I am welcome in the UK. When relations sour, anti-China stance is taken, and I am excluded. Now, I'm going to caveat that, because when it comes to the courts, they take evidence quite seriously and scrutinise that. So the judgment, if you read it in detail, it does make clear that, in part, some of what the Home Secretary's team have alleged against Mr. Yang feels a bit thin, if that's the right word. There isn't a great deal there, but that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't a case. And the key thing for the courts in deciding to uphold this banning order was the Home Secretary more likely to have been right than wrong, and was that decision reasonable? And it was, in its view, and that's why he's been excluded.
Right. Well, Charles, let's talk about this in kind of general terms then, rather than trying to guess what's going on in this case, or try and guess about some secret evidence that was presented to a court that none of us were able to actually see or listen to. Let's define some terms, first of all. Like, does China have classic spies? And actually, are they trying to do something a bit more subtle than what you might think of as spying or interfering in British national life?
Well, certainly it has spies. It has the Ministry of State Security, civilian service, and it has the military service. And they're very, very extensive, as our heads of our three intelligence services have been saying over the last year or so. I mean, you might remember the phrase, when it comes to espionage, they've been describing Russia as the storm and China as climate change. I mean, it's worth talking a little bit about the United Front Work Department, because it's become the sort of bogeyman of the press that, and people say, well, it's an intelligence organisation.
Yeah, what is it?
First of all, it is and it isn't an intelligence organisation. It isn't in the sense of, classic CIA, KGB, MI6 or whatever, running agents over classified information. But it is in the business of, I think the better word than influence is interference. Influence is a perfectly acceptable form of diplomatic work. We all have. Another word for it is public diplomacy. We're trying to influence other countries.
Well, yeah, the British ambassador in Washington is trying to influence the US government.
Interference, no, that is not acceptable. And that has been defined, I think it was an Australian Prime Minister who first put it most succinctly, as behaviour that is covert, coercive and corrupting. But I think the other important thing about the United Front is actually to understand the United Front strategy. This goes back right to the beginnings of the Communist Party, and indeed, Chairman Mao, well before the PRC was set up, the Communists came to power, declared that there were three magic weapons of the Communist cause. One was the party, the second was the People's Liberation Army, and the third was the United Front. So it's one of the six major departments of the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping has strengthened it very considerably in 2015, 2018. So what is, and originally it's a domestic beast. It's about bringing onto the communist side those who are not the natural communists. So it might be religious figures, Hong Kong figures.
Persuading Chinese people.
Cultural figures, the new private sector that has arisen or whatever. But as China's globalized, it's gone abroad. And the United Front strategy, which it has long used inside China, roughly goes as follows. You identify the main enemy, and in the early days that would have been the Kuomintang, the National Party, and you seek to move those who are on the side of the main enemy to a neutral position, and those who are in a neutral position to align themselves with the Communist Party. Well, here we are in a very much globalized world, and the United Front strategy identifies America as the main enemy, and those who are allies and close to America must be moved to the neutral position, and that includes the UK. And those that are in a more neutral position should be shifted towards the China side, and that's why they're putting an awful lot of work into the developing world, etc.
Yeah, and so it's if you can't make somebody an ally, you can at least maybe split them off from China's opponents.
Yes,
is the kind of big goal. And then how does a government like the British government kind of deal with that threat? Because it's not as simple as like you can see a drone. If someone is actually committing a crime or stealing something, you can prosecute them. What do you do about this stuff that's a bit more diffuse?
You're right, because it's much more of a problem. I mean, when you're in the world of espionage, no doubt MI5 has its ways of tracking people who are behaving in a very covert fashion and dealing with them. But in this case, I mean, and you know, as the judgment shows, it's not so much black and white. Yes, this is 100% a bounty. It's the Home Secretary's judgment that there are elements there which threaten our national security or our interests, and we have a right to protect those.
There's a great paragraph from the Home Secretary's letter to Mr. Yang, which sums up what you're saying, Charles. Can I just read this out?
Please do, yeah.
This is the letter that he was sent telling him he was being banned. We have reason to believe that you are engaging or have previously engaged in covert and deceptive activity on behalf of the United Front Work Department, which is an arm of the Chinese Communist Party. The UFWD is reported to have a remit to engage in political interference. So this is your point, isn't it? Including targeting the UK's democratic processes. As such, it is likely that you pose a threat to UK national security.
Yes, that sums it up.
I'm just not sure how you draw the line between influence and interference. Like I sort of feel like maybe I'd know it if I saw it, but it's quite hard to define where the line is.
Well,
or is it?
That's true about quite a lot of things in life. I mean, the judge, what was it called, Robert Sutter, I think, in America, said it's very difficult to define pornography, but I recognise it when I see it. And I think you're absolutely right. The same applies perhaps to this interference business. I mean, you can define it if you like as covert, coercive, and corrupting. And sometimes that's very obvious, but there will inevitably be times when it's fairly grey and you have to make it.
But yeah, for example, Beijing having a policy of encouraging lots of Chinese students to come and study in the UK, which means that lots of educational institutions in the UK are kind of quite reliant on those Chinese students because they can charge them big fees. Is that interference or influence, or is that just like basic geopolitical economics playing out?
No, that's fine. But when you start controlling those students and getting them to do tasks in the UK, which are against our interests, that might be against our academic freedoms or freedoms of speech, that is definitely interference. And there was quite an interesting piece, I thought, phrase in that in the emails or between the advisors and Mr. Yang, where it talks about setting up a think tank. And this is classic United Front work. I mean, pay to set up a think tank or get people not so directly connected with you to set up a think tank and influence the output, because think tanks do influence. That's the whole point of setting one up.
They inject ideas and evidence into the conversation, the national conversation.
They are, and they're there to put ideas to government and perhaps when officials don't have so much time to go into the depths of certain backgrounds of certain policies to come up with ideas and etc. So China puts a lot of effort through the United Front and others into interfering with, influencing, whichever word you like to say, think tanks. And I can think of a few examples of that. So when there's a suggestion that the Duke of York might like to head up or be the patron of a think tank, immediately I thought to myself, yeah, well, I've seen that before.
And it was great seeing you two quoting the judgment and the documents to each other, because actually this is one of those rare moments where we all get a glimpse into something that's actually very secret and quite shadowy.
Well, we're
it's
trying
now stuff that's on the record that we can quote and read.
Well, we're trying to get more documents in this case now. This guy has been named, and particularly because of this really, really quite ambiguous reference to a think tank, because that was clearly part of the Home Secretary's case that the words here, the Duke was considering the creation of a think tank. Now, was that something he'd come up with himself? Was it something which had been suggested to him by Mr. Yang or another advisor? One assumes, you can infer from this, it was a think tank linked to the UK and China, but we don't know for sure. So we're going to keep pursuing this, trying to find out what we can.
Good. I'm glad you are. Charles, thank you very much.
A pleasure. Thank you.
And Dom, thanks to you too.
Thanks.
And we've got a statement from Beijing, from China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They say that Beijing has, quote, always acted with dignity and honesty and never engaged in any deception or interference. And they said it's not worth refuting this kind of unjust hype for itself and others. Now, as promised, we're going to talk about Angela Rayner's big plans for changing local government in England. The short version is she wants to get rid of district councils. Those are those councils that sit above parish councils but below county councils in some parts of England. They don't exist everywhere, but they do exist in lots of places. Also, somewhere that exists in some places and not others is these combined mayoral authorities, which have a quite powerful, quite visible mayor. They're going to be rolled out to more places. And this is being billed as the biggest shake-up to how England is governed at a local level in half a century. It is a big deal, or at least that's what the government says it is. My colleague from Westminster, our politics and investigations correspondent, Joe Pike, has been following Angela Rayner all day and reading all the small print, and he can update us on it now. Hello, Joe.
Hi, Adam.
Right, there's lots to chew over here. So first of all, what is going to disappear from the kind of local government architecture of England?
Well, it seems that gradually district councils will be phased out. Angela Rayner doesn't seem too keen on two-tier council setups where you might have a lower district or borough or city council, which does things like bin collections, maybe leisure centres, green spaces, and then higher up a county council that would deal with things like social care and education. She seems keen on the word unitarisation, having a unitary authority, one council that does all of that, and then above a number of those bigger councils having a regional mayor. So ultimately, I think the Deputy Prime Minister would like, at some stage, perhaps in the next decade, for every person in England to have one council and one regional mayor.
She's also given a new word to anyone who's ever been dumped. You can just say, I've been unitarised. Anyway, right, let's hear how the Deputy Prime Minister put it when you asked her whether she basically had an issue with these district councils. This is your question and her answer.
What have you got against district councils, though, Deputy Prime Minister?
I don't have a thing against district councils. I think working together, though, at a unitarisation, you get a bigger scale. So some of those district councils...
So you want the councils to go, ideally?
So those district councils will acknowledge that their footprint often isn't able to deal with things like health inequalities. People do not work and live and, transport their lives via the district council or even the metropolitan borough council they may live in. So it's about making sure you can scale up to deliver the real change and unlock the potential of those areas.
So that's Angela Rayner selling the pros of unitarisation. What are some people suggesting might be the cons of this?
Well, if you live, in particular, I'd say, Adam, in a rural area, and today we were in North Kesteven, an area of Lincolnshire around Sleaford, that is a very rural area with a lot of people over a vast area. And the council leader I spoke to, a Conservative council leader, wasn't against this plan, but seemed, I think, sceptical, partly because he argues the way that you provide services in a local area and a rural local area is very different from an urban one, and the way you communicate with people, the way you do day-to-day services, the way you run a leisure centre, for example. We went to a leisure centre, we went to look at some of their green spaces, we went to watch their bin collections happen. And his argument, at least, was that you can't use some one-size-fits-all urban plan in a place like this, where people's experiences are very different. And when you build communities, he argues, in a different way. He says his job is not just about building houses and providing services, but building communities. And he seemed to think that if his area of Lincolnshire just had one council covering, I mean, honestly, an absolutely enormous area of what is now 7 lower councils, 5 district, 1 borough and 1 city council, that local people would notice the difference. The other argument you hear from other people is that because the upper tier, county councils, are often dealing with adult social care, which of course is a huge part of the local authority budget, if you merge the two, a lot of public money, a lot of taxpayers' money does get hoovered up by the pressures of adult social care and therefore local services, including bin collections, which of course people really care about, do suffer.
And the flip side of getting rid of things is giving more powers to the people who will then ultimately be in charge of these unitary authorities, which will exist everywhere. And we've already got examples of that in existence already. So the mayors of London and Greater Manchester are doing a lot of this stuff that Angela Rayner wants other people to do.
Absolutely, and those mayors, both Sadiq Khan and Andy Burnham, were here in Leeds today with some of their other lesser-known mayoral colleagues, and people on both sides of the political sphere, Conservative Ben Houchen and Labour Mayor of Greater Manchester Andy Burnham, seemed positive about what Angela Rayner was announcing today, because it isn't just this unitarisation in different parts of the country. For them, it means more powers, and particularly more powers for the current regional mayors, the metro mayors, on transport and infrastructure. Now, Andy Burnham already has transport powers and has been proudly talking about his B network of buses in Greater Manchester. But it seems what Angela Rayner and the Labour government want to do is give powers over infrastructure and transport to these regional figureheads, partly so they can effectively ask those regional mayors to try and achieve some of their targets when it comes to both house building and economic growth. Those are two things that Labour government are really focusing on. Those are part of Keir Starmer's missions and his plan for change. And he seems to basically be asking some of the mayors to pick up that work.
And so just to be clear, once all of this is done, if this all gets implemented as the government wants to, does this mean every single adult in England will be able to vote for a mayor-like figure in their patch, however big their patch is?
That does seem to be Angela Rayner's long-term ambition, and I asked that very clearly to her today, and she said, yes, I want everyone in England to have a mayor. However, it doesn't seem at the moment like Labour want to railroad this through. They do want the consent of local areas, and for local areas to work out what is the best model for them. So having a combined authority, which is a body made up of the leaders of a lot of councils, so it's effectively like a sort of a cabinet of council leaders, that may be a model without a mayor for some regions. But certainly what we've seen, both under the Conservatives, and I think probably happening under Labour too, is those areas that do have a accountable figurehead like Andy Burnham or Ben Houchen or indeed Sadiq Khan, they do get extra powers and maybe money too. So there are incentives for areas to follow the model that clearly is one Angela Rayner favours.
I wonder if this is a recipe for more politics. And I don't just mean that age-old trope that always gets wheeled out whenever we talk about devolution at any level of like, oh, do the public really want more politicians in their lives? But I just mean whether creating more big figures who can ask for things or kick up a fuss when they don't get things. And also, I just think over the last few years, the funding of local councils, successive prime ministers and chancellors have been able to cut it quite dramatically, but it's not super obvious for us to see when you look at politics from Westminster, because there's lots of different pots of money scattered around the place. But if you're combining these things into bigger things, if you cut them or starve them of funds or give one place more money than others, it all just becomes a bit more obvious, which means there's more kind of regional, local politics around the place.
Absolutely. And councils really are struggling. And if you are a district council leader who's really had a tough time in recent years, does this reorganisation, which will be certainly time-consuming and energy-consuming, question mark over what it costs and what the savings could be, is it what is best for voters, for real people? Certainly it seems that by unitarisation, we are going to have fewer politicians because you'll have fewer councillors. You might have a sort of equivalent of a county councillor, not a local councillor. But then, as one local government boss said to me today, I mean, our local area, he argued, has a couple of thousand people per councillor, and that may change to 10,000 people per councillor. So you're linked to somebody who can solve that problem with a tree in your street or the bin collection in your community or some problem with something in your local park, that may be more distant. Certainly what I've noticed from covering a lot of different regions in different jobs over the past few years is that the mayors who do well are the ones who realise that becoming a public figure, a well-known celebrity, those are the ones that have most success. They do become a figurehead. Their original power is just really about convenience. They didn't have many powers originally, but now we're getting to a stage where at least some of them can argue they have changed things. There is real tangible change, and that is a shift from the early days of some of these regional mayors. I'm not talking about London, but I'm talking mainly the north of England, where those regional mayors that George Osborne, of course, brought in, were really complaining that it was a job and a title, but there wasn't really much power they had to play with. That time is over. The powers are moving from Westminster and Whitehall to those regions, and now the pressure is on, Adam, for them to prove they can do something with it.
And then there was a little plot twist today because we're due a big set of elections in local authorities in England in 2025. So what does this shake-up mean for them? And you asked Angela Rayner that very question. Here's what she said.
Well, I'm not planning and proposing to cancel any elections. If we've got a reorganisation and we're right near the line, then obviously if councils come to us and said we want a delay for a year so that we can get this deal over the line, then that's something we'd have to look at.
In other words, wait and see. Joe, thank you very much for filling us in. Also, though, I suppose actually we've got this spending review. And so the next big thing that's going to happen to local authorities in England is their budgets for the next few years, which will sit alongside this big reorganisation. Like there's kind of two big things happening simultaneously.
Absolutely. And there have been big events where chancellors have stood up in recent years and said, I'm going to give money to this mayor and this combined authority. Other parts of the country have been thinking, perhaps, what do we get? And that time may be changing if Angela Rayner gets her way. There are more mayors, more combined authorities, and perhaps more name checks in future fiscal events.
Joe, thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam. Bye.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. You can now go and download the Fetching Santa Hat clad Chris Mason and then go and take a picture of him in a setting that is Christmassy or important to you or somewhere fun that you happen to be at the moment. And then get emailing or WhatsApping us with your Father Christmasin pictures. It's newscast@bbc.co.uk, or you can WhatsApp us on 0330 123 9480. And over the next 12 or 20 hours, I will be WhatsApping the Newscast team about what we're going to put in the next episode of Newscast, which you will be able to get very soon. Bye-bye.